My name is Jessica Reynolds, and I'm the Director of the Office of Downtown Development here at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, and we are so grateful to have you with us today. I am very excited to introduce you to Angela Threadgill. She is the Executive Director of Easements Atlanta, and I will say that I've had the pleasure of getting to know her a little bit better this morning and chitty-chatting with her before this webinar kicked off, and I think you guys are in for a definite treat. She seems like a wealth of information and knowledge, and I'm excited because I think I'm going to definitely learn something here today too. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to her and we will get started.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the Department of Community Affairs as well as the Georgia Main Street program for inviting me here today to spread the word about facade easements as a preservation tool and incentive. I've been with the organization for about 4 years. But Easements Atlanta has been around since 1984, and we currently hold 40 preservation easements within the Atlanta area, which includes the city of Atlanta, but also the urban outreaches of Fulton County, DeKalb County, and Cobb County. Easements Atlanta's mission is to accept and hold donations of facade easements or preservation easements. Let's see here. So while we focus on the metro Atlanta area, here are some stars showing where other preservation easement programs are located throughout the state of Georgia. If you do not see a star located near you, don't worry. The Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation also has a preservation easement program. They are a statewide organization, and they can assist those communities that do not have a local easement program. So what is a preservation easement? Well, a preservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement between a private property owner and a charitable organization or government agency that protects a significant historic property, and it's conveyed through a security deed, and that security deed outlines specific restrictions that are placed on that property, and it's done in perpetuity. And I like this illustration because every property owner has a bundle of rights that they have, and they are giving up certain development rights. And those development rights have a value, and we're going to dive into that a little bit later, and that's where the tax incentives are. Preservation easements are not new. They were created as part of the 1976 Federal Tax Reform Act, and that Tax Reform Act aligns the national historic preservation policies to encourage the private sector to invest in preserving historic buildings. Up until this point, the U.S. tax code favored the demolition of older buildings, and that's how we got a lot of urban renewal projects that we dislike today. But it favored the demolition of older buildings over saving them. And now the concept of preservation easements predate that Tax Reform Act by about 20 years. The city of Charleston, the Charleston Historical Foundation in 1958 created a revolving fund. They purchased distressed properties and then found a buyer to rehabilitate that, but they resold it with protective covenants. And so those were some of the early concepts of preservation easements. The city of Savannah, the Savannah Historic Foundation, started up their program in 1959. So they kind of set the stage, the precursor to how we operate today and what those deed agreements look like. One other thing I wanted to point out is in 1976, that Tax Reform Act put on the books about, well, a little over 10 tax incentives for older properties and to protect historic buildings. And the only two that are left today are the Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit and the Charitable deduction for the preservation easements. Those are the only two that are left on the books. And that's why it's so important to advocate for these two programs, because these are the only two that are left that provide a national source of funds to protect our historic resources. So before I continue on, it's good to learn some of the terminology that I'll be using today, make sure we're all on the same page. The first is the term conservation easement, and this is what I consider the umbrella term. It's used by the Internal Revenue Service, it's used in the Internal Revenue Code. Conservation easements cover historic resources, but it also protects farmland, open space, forest, wildlife habitats, wetlands, battlefields. So it covers a broad range of property types. But of course, in the 80s, I think the preservationists wanted to separate themselves to distinguish ourselves. And so we called them preservation easements. And underneath preservation easements is what's called a facade easement. The majority of what Easements Atlanta holds is a facade easement because it's in an urban environment, it's a commercial property typically, and it covers the building envelope. There's not a whole lot of land around it, so it's a facade easement. We do hold a few preservation easements because we have incorporated the land around the building, but a facade easement is typically just the building envelope. So that's how we distinguish ourselves there. The next is restrictions, and sometimes you'll hear folks talk about preservation covenants, restrictive, there's a whole gambit of terms, but ultimately they all serve the same purpose. They are there to preserve the architectural and historical integrity of the property. The next is the easement contribution. Upon receiving a donation, most, if not all, of the charitable organizations that accept these types of donations request what might be considered a stewardship fee or an endowment fee or some sort of contribution to assist the organization with carrying out the terms of the agreement. And I'll show you how that's usually calculated. The next is the type of tax incentive that we're talking about today. At this time, we are only talking about tax incentives at the federal level. Unfortunately, we do not have the equivalency at the state level. So this is at only the federal income tax. So there's a deduction versus a tax credit. And what this is, if you're thinking about charitable donations, that is an income tax deduction. And so donors would be using Form 8283. It would be considered a non-cash charitable contribution, and it's not considered a tax credit as the same way as a rehabilitation tax credit. So there's a difference. It's under different parts of the tax code. The other is the duration of the preservation easement or facade easement, is that it needs to be in perpetuity. It cannot have a term of 5 years, 20 years, or even 99 years. It needs to be in perpetuity should a property owner want to take advantage of the tax incentive. So why would a property owner donate a preservation easement? The first is that this is a guaranteed permanent protection of significant properties. And there are different levels of how to protect a historic property, but this one I consider the strongest, and I'll show you in a different slide why that is. The next is that the donors can enjoy tax benefits. There's 3 main tax benefits that pertain to income, property taxes, and estate taxes, and I'll go over that as well. The next is that the public benefits from the permanent protection of historic resources. The whole purpose behind these types of tax incentives is that there needs to be a public benefit. And of course, saving a historic resource within our communities adds to our quality of life. And then the next is, historic preservation is a public benefit, but ultimately the owners of historic properties are the ones who bear that cost, either through lost development opportunities or through extra cost associated with restoring or maintaining the historic property. As we know, it can be labor and costly to maintain a historic building. And the monetary compensation from local and state governments is very limited. And so the preservation easement the donation program offers a nationally available source of financial support for owners of historic properties to offset those costs. And then the last is very important. This program applies to a variety of property types, whether it is income producing, owner occupied, commercial, residential. This program is wide open. And then also it can apply to different buildings. It can apply to distressed properties, or it can apply to buildings that have always been maintained in good condition. And I think that's important to say because conversely, the rehabilitation tax credit program, to take advantage of that, it usually needs to be an income producing property, and it also needs to meet the substantial rehabilitation test. And so that doesn't apply in this program. So it can apply to a variety of property types and a variety of conditions. So that first income tax benefit, donations of easements qualify as a charitable contribution under the Internal Revenue Code, Section 170H. And the donation value is deductible from the federal income taxes in the same manner as other non-cash charitable contributions. And then the next one is the property tax benefits. And this is mainly applicable to properties that are taxed based on their highest and best use. And, if we think about our downtowns and our main street areas, the commercial areas, usually those are taxed or assessed at the highest and best use. So in this particular case, the topic that we're here today, the property tax potentially could be lowered as a result of lowering the value through the preservation easement program. So that's a biggie for a lot of our donors. And then the next is the estate tax benefits. Usually this is used by families where the heirs will take future care of the homesteads, but I could also see this being used by legacy businesses where the next generation is going to continue the family business in their historic Main Street building. And I can think of a few places, a few buildings in the city of Atlanta that could definitely take advantage of that, and maybe you have some in your own communities. But the external benefits are to the community. It protects the historical resource. It preserves neighborhood character. So if there's a lot of historic buildings, usually the protection of one of those buildings, assist in preserving the neighborhood character and encourages other property owners to preserve their historic structure. The other one is that it enhances land value in the neighborhood. And then it also makes the neighborhood more attractive to residences and businesses. One thing that I want to point out is to claim the federal income tax deduction at least some visual access to the property must be available, and the degree of access is tailored to the amount of the protection. For most facade easements in our downtown, you know, just seeing it from the street or the sidewalk is enough. There have been in some instances where the property owner wants to protect the interior of the structure, say a historic lobby or a banking hall. That needs to be open to the public. If the interior is protected, then it needs to be visible to the public, whether it's once a year or just during business hours. That's important, and that's actually within the Internal Revenue Code. That's one of the stipulations. But most of ours in our portfolio are exterior only. And then the last one I want to point out is the maximization of preservation dollars, the local and state tax rolls. This helps keep properties on the tax rolls. I think a lot of times the community looks to nonprofits to own these buildings, to take care of them, turn them into a house museum or turn them into their nonprofit offices. And not all of us can do that. So this helps property owners keep a hold of their properties. It offsets those costs and keeps the properties on the tax rolls, which is very important. So what are the qualifications for charitable easement donations? The first is that the donor has to have a real property interest. It can't be a tenant or a long-term lessee. The owner's name, the donor has to be the name on the deed. Another point on this note, is that typically nonprofits and religious institutions don't have a tax liability, and so they wouldn't necessarily be able to take advantage of the charitable deduction. So I do want to point that out. The next is that the donation must be given to a government agency or a charitable organization whose mission is historic preservation. Ideally, they will have a program already in place. They'll have the resources to carry that donation into perpetuity. So you want an organization that's been around for a while and has those resources. The next is the donation has to have a conservation purpose. Technically, what that means for purposes of historic buildings is that it be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and that it also protect the building envelope. It can't just be one facade or two facades. It needs to be the building envelope. And the reason being is this occurred in like New York and Chicago, where only the front facade was being protected. And in, I want to say in the 90s, the back of the building was being demolished, and only that front facade, which was, you know, what was protected under the easement agreement, was, you know, saved, but the entire, you know, back portion was demolished. And so we were, you know, seeing a lot of buildings that look like, you know, the old Western movie sets with 2x4s holding up the front facade, and they would go behind and build an entirely new building that didn't necessarily have any relationship to the front facade. So in 2006, the Internal Revenue Service caught on to that, and they rewrote certain portions of the code to prohibit you know, that sort of demolition by requiring that the entire building envelope be protected by the easement. The next is that the deed restrictions are in perpetuity. As I had mentioned before, it can't be a term limit. And it's because the public is investing their interest in this property. I mean, the property owner is, taking a tax deduction, and if there's a term limit, you know, say 20 years from now, the public has lost that benefit that they have, you know, bought into, essentially. The next is that it be subordinated to other liens. So if there's mortgages on the property, you know, those need to be subordinated to the deed agreement. And I have a case study for you to show, because this was happening all over the states, is that organizations did not secure a subordination agreement from the lien holders, and we were losing our preservation easements. So yeah, that was another change in the tax code, but that was in 1986. Oh, and then the last is that the value should be substantiated through a qualified appraisal done by a qualified appraiser. If you remember back to that bundle of rights, that the little stick of development rights, that holds value. And I'll get into how that's calculated. The next is, what does a deed agreement look like? Most of the clauses that are within the deed agreement are prescribed by the Internal Revenue Code. And most of the deed agreements are very common among all of the organizations. There's 3 to 5 attachments that you know, go along with the deed agreement. Obviously, the very first one is the legal description. What are the boundaries of the preservation easement? What is it protecting? The next is the baseline documentation, and it's exactly that. It sets and documents what the baseline condition of the building is, so that in 10, 20, 30 years, because we've been in existence for 30 years, we can go back to that baseline documentation and determine whether that crack in the exterior wall has grown, or you know, if an addition was constructed on the back without former approval, we have that baseline documentation. The next is obviously any existing liens or encumbrances on the property would be an attachment, as well as that mortgage subordination that I mentioned. And then the last is, this is applicable only if there's a phased schedule for rehabilitation. And so there's a series of clauses that we would put in whereby if there's repairs that are needed, we focus on the structural members and masonry walls, or replacement of the roof surface or structural elements. So we focus on the structural phase first, and we work with the donor to determine which date is going to work best for them, and we fill that in together. The next is updating the heating, electrical, plumbing systems, and again, we work on a date to determine what's feasible for them. And then, of course, the interior and exterior work. So this is a phased schedule, and it's worked into the deed agreement to make sure that the rehabilitation is completed in a timely manner. And so what are the property owner's responsibilities going forward? The first is to continue to own and manage the property consistent with the restrictions of the deed agreement. And one important note is that the restrictions are passed along to the next owner. The other is that the property owner continue to pay property taxes, and they also need to allow the easement holding organization to monitor the property. And it isn't unlike, your local code enforcement, but we just want to make sure that the property is maintained in good condition and that unsympathetic alterations don't occur. And then also notify the easement holding organization before transferring the property. So some of the typical restrictions, the first is that Any alterations to the property, any exterior alterations, comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. Many historic preservation commissions use these. I mean, these are national standards. I believe the Georgia Main Street program for rehabilitations use those standards. The next are the limitations on alterations, and that again ties back into those standards for rehabilitation. Those standards would limit unsympathetic alterations that affect the architecture of the building. The next is receiving prior written permission before commencing work. And again, we would be using those standards to review any proposed projects. With the easement deed agreement, there is an absolute prohibition on demolition. That's one of the requirements that the Internal Revenue Code puts forth. Again, the public is investing into the building, and should it be demolished, that benefit goes away. And as a taxpayer, I would hate to see that lost. The next is the limitation on use. And I don't want to scare anybody by saying that, but what that means is that should a proposed use come in that affects the architectural character, the architectural integrity of the building, it may not be the best use for the building. It doesn't preclude adaptive reuse of buildings, but if we're taking storefronts and turning it into a loading dock, that might not necessarily be a good use for the building, because that would be a major change to the architectural integrity. And then the next is the limitation on subdivisions. And again, that's I think this more or less pertains to preservation easements where there's land around the building, because it becomes very hard to track the ownership of the property, and it kind of degrades the purpose of the preservation easement to protect it. The only exception is the condominiums, for residential buildings. And then here are some of the responsibilities that Easements Atlanta or other easement holding organizations have. We do our baseline documentation, our annual monitoring. We like to maintain positive relationships with all of our property owners because we want to encourage voluntary compliance with that deed agreement. Obviously, we have to maintain our records and administer the program. On occasion, there are enforcements that need to occur, but ultimately we go back to encouraging voluntary compliance. We also have to maintain adequate funding to carry out our responsibilities. And then the last one is where I have the most fun as staff to the easement program, is providing technical support and assistance. So like I have a photograph here of the Brushworks building. Unfortunately, this is in an area of the city of Atlanta that gets tagged a lot with graffiti. And so we are working with this particular building on looking to remedy that for the long term. So that's part of my fun part of my job. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the strength of preservation easements. And let's take a look at the legal methods used to protect historic resources. The National Register of Historic Places, as we know, is a way to recognize historic properties. However, it doesn't necessarily provide any restrictions in protecting the property unless they're using federal monies, such as the rehabilitation tax credits, or maybe a Section 106 review, but it doesn't necessarily protect the building in the long run. The next is the local zoning ordinance, and I show a picture of the Oddfellows building as an example. The the local zoning ordinance in this particular zoning district, I believe, allows up to 45 feet. There are certain off-street parking requirements that need to happen, as part of this district. There's certain setbacks, lot coverage, FAR, floor area ratio. So the Oddfellows building actually exceed what is permitted by right today in the local zoning ordinance. So it doesn't, there's no reason why a property owner would actually demolish this building, because they would never be able to build back to what they have today. But this is in very rare cases that happens. Most of our downtowns, our commercial districts, allow a lot taller building and more bulk floor area. So this is a very rare occurrence. The next is our local preservation ordinance, and unfortunately, all of our preservation ordinances are different. Some can delay demolition up to 180 days, but doesn't necessarily prevent the demolition. Some jurisdictions have very strong ordinances, but they have very weak standards of review or relaxed interpretations. And sometimes demolitions are subject of local politics. So while local preservation ordinances have some teeth, it isn't necessarily the strongest tool. And that's why I say that preservation easements are an excellent tool, the strongest tool that we have to protect historic resources from demolition, because there is that clause in the deed agreement that prohibits demolition, and that is a requirement of the Internal Revenue Code. And I have a little case study to kind of show you. This is the Glen Building in downtown Atlanta. The facade easement was donated to Easements Atlanta in 1988, and it was used as an office building until a downturn in the market in the late 80s, early 90s. The ownership was conveyed to the Federal Reserve Bank through foreclosure, and they owned it for about 12 years, after which, I won't say the name, but a famous media mogul bought the Glen Building with hopes to demolish it to expand a parking deck. And one of the real estate directors at the Federal Reserve, who was in support of these plans, was quoted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, this is back in 1999, by saying, "Who's going to spend money on something like that? It's just an old, antiquated office building." And by 2001, this conflict was playing out in the local press, between Easements Atlanta and the media mogul. There were very influential supporters on both sides of the issue, and eventually this media mogul asked the city to condemn the property based on public good. I mean, at this point, it was a distressed, somewhat vacant property. And they also asked the city to look at eminent domain, because this media mogul was going to put a small public park that would run in front of the parking deck. And now, if I can paint a picture here, this public park was going to be maybe 10 to 15 feet deep, running the length of the property, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 square feet of a park, maybe a room for 1 or 2 park benches so that you could sit and watch one of the main arterial streets in downtown. But Easements Atlanta held its ground, and this played out finally in 2003. The media mogul had scrapped its plans. This is, after about 4 years of, going back and forth. It never actually went to the courts, but there was a lot of talk among our attorneys and their attorneys But ultimately, in 2003, the property was purchased by Legacy Property Group, and they did not see it as an old, antiquated office building. And they have kept the building and they converted it into a very lovely boutique hotel. And as a side note to this, that media mogul is now one of the biggest proponents of conservation easements, having protected thousands of open space and acreage out west. And I would like to think that it all started with the Glenn building. So speaking of, how to terminate an easement, it is very hard to terminate an easement, and it's meant to be hard because it needs to protect the public investment in that charitable tax deduction. And there are three main ways that an easement would be terminated. That is either through the destruction, whether it's a fire or tornado, that effectively makes it infeasible for the property to be used, to convey the purposes of preservation and history. The next is through mortgage subordination, and I'll go into that. But ultimately, there has to be judicial proceedings in a court of law, and the judge has to make a final judgment that concludes that there are several things, that a change in conditions makes the continued use for preservation or conservation purposes impossible. They have to specifically say that the deed and agreement is extinguished, and then there's proceeds that have to be paid back to the easement holding organization so that they can continue their good work in conservation and preservation easements. And I have a quick case study on that. Here's the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. There was a tornado in 2008 that damaged a good portion of the building. Easements Atlanta was involved in assessing the damage. We had preservation architects, structural engineers there assessing the damage, determining the feasibility of the restoration, and obviously in this next slide, we were able to conclude that it was feasible to build back those portions of the building. And then the next is the mortgage subordination. This is the Fairleigh Poplar Lofts in the Fairleigh Poplar National Register Historic District in downtown Atlanta. It was originally donated in 1984. This is one of our first donations over 30 years ago. And it consisted of 5 buildings shown here. Unfortunately, the property was foreclosed upon in 1988, and the mortgage holder, there was a mortgage originally on the property, and unfortunately, because we were not able to secure a mortgage subordination, that encumbrance, the preservation easement, is an encumbrance on the property, and when it foreclosed, it reverted back to, prior encumbrances. So it kind of wiped the pages clean of any reference to the preservation easement. There was property owners that purchased it out of foreclosure, redonated 3 of the 5 in 1997. So at least we have 3 of those back. The reason we do not have those 2 is because it's a nonprofit organization, and they don't really have the incentive in place to make that donation. But they just spent a lot of rehabilitation money, so I don't see those buildings going anywhere. But that's the effects. I mean, this was happening all over in the 1980s, where the requirement for mortgage subordinations, that wasn't part of the code. And in 1986, That's when the Internal Revenue Code was amended to require this, because this was happening everywhere where we were losing that investment in properties protected by preservation easements. So let's jump to how the value of a preservation easement is appraised. First, the appraisal has to be done by a qualified appraiser, someone who is familiar with doing these types of appraisals. The next is the appraiser looks at the existing encumbrances to help determine the property value. And they use the before and after method. And let me jump forward. Here are the appraisal standards. So that appraiser is going to be using the 3 traditional approaches to valuation: the sales comparison approach, the income approach, and the cost approach, and come to a conclusion of what that before value is. Then they're going to take a look at the after value. They're going to try to use the willing buyer and willing seller approach. This is used if there is a market where facade easements are being sold, where properties with facade easements are being sold. This is rare in Atlanta and the Georgia area. I think this is more typical of places in New York, Chicago, DC, where there's a lot more properties protected by preservation easements. The appraiser is going to take into account the amount attributed to the loss of control over the building's exterior, because, you know, if you think back to those development rights and that stick, you know, there's some loss of control in alterations to the exterior of the building. There's also the lost development potential, because we're protecting the envelope of the building, and we can't necessarily build up if there's room to build up. And then, of course, the appraiser is going to look at recent tax court cases, the current zoning district and the limitations there, the real estate market, development calculations in terms of, you know, if it's a commercial property, what type of rents can be received, and then obviously use their professional opinion. Here is an example of one of our downtown Georgia communities. This particular zoning district allows up to 80 feet. And so there is an unrealized development potential here, and this is by right in the zoning district. And this is a historic building. It is a certified historic building. And so this particular property owner approached us about donating the easement to take advantage of those tax incentives, because he would be giving up a large chunk of development potential there, because I think this is around maybe 28 to 30 feet tall. So there is definitely, this building could be leveled and an 80-foot building in its place. So that's why this tool is so important, to protect that downtown character. So thinking about that same list of ways to protect a property, I want you to think of that now in terms of levels of restrictions. And here we have the National Register. It's listed from minimal restrictions to the highest restrictions. So how do those existing restrictions affect value? And I have examples here that show when you have very minimal restrictions, the value of the easement is going to be higher, as opposed to a location that has a lot of restrictions, such as a local historic district, that the value of the easement is going to be lower, so high, low. So let me go back. Did I cover everything? Okay, all right. So this is a typical easements donation process. The first 3 are considered kind of the due diligence period. You'll want to contact your local easement holding organization or the Georgia Trust, and then obtain a certified historic designation to show that you meet those minimum qualifications that it's listed on the National Register. And then you'll want to work, if there's a mortgage or a lien on the property, you'll want to work with that bank or lien holders to subordinate those mortgages. And so before you move on and spend money on a real estate appraisal, you want to make sure you have the easement holding organization on board, that certified historic designation, as well as that subordination in hand. Because the real estate appraisal, can cost between $2,000 and $10,000 depending on the complexity of the property. And once that real estate appraisal is complete and is issued, the Internal Revenue Code places a time limit of 60 days to convey the preservation easement and record it, because they want the most applicable and recent market evaluation. So obviously there's a little bit more to this, but that's kind of the basic process. Here's some of the fees and costs that a property owner will pay up front. Obviously that appraisal fee, as I had mentioned. If a survey is needed of the property, that needs to be done to get that legal description. If you need to have the property listed on the National Register, you'll need to hire a preservation consultant, and obviously they charge a fee as well. Any attorney's fees, like an accounting, CPA, or other attorneys, those fees will be there. And then the deed recording of fee, it's usually around $50. Most easement holding organizations have an application fee of around $500 to $1,500. It varies. And then, as I mentioned before, the easement holding organizations usually request a donation, a monetary donation, because if we think about the long-term implications of carrying out that deed agreement, upholding that easement agreement, enforcing the terms of that agreement, it can be costly. It might not be needed so much during the time that the donor owns the property, but it certainly is applicable 20, 30 years from now when multiple owners have owned it, and the enforcement may need to happen. But we calculate it using 2% of the donation fee, and you can kind of see those calculations here. And that donation is put in an endowment where hopefully it earns money.
And so those fees on the left are typically paid by the person
The donor.
The donor. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then I get asked quite a lot about how to combine all of these tax incentives. Investors, property owners come to me and kind of ask, how do we maximize all of these tax incentives? So for the purposes of this example, these tax incentives are available to properties within the city of Atlanta. Other jurisdictions may or may not offer the same local property tax abatement program, but at least 4 of them are available. So the first is to take advantage of the federal and state income tax credit programs. These are for qualified rehabilitations. Once the rehabilitation is complete, you'll want to do that tax freeze through the Rehabilitated Historic Property Tax Abatement Program that is offered through the State Historic Preservation Office, where it freezes the taxes for 8 years, and then by the 10th year it goes back to the normal or current market rate. And then with the federal and state income tax credit program, the National Park Service and the State Preservation Office, they stay vested in the property for 5 years. Once that 5-year period has burned off, that is when you will want to convey that preservation easement and take advantage of the federal income tax deduction. And the reason why, you know, they can be done in tandem. However, you won't be able to maximize those dollars. And the reason being is that when an easement is placed on a building that is the source of a rehabilitation tax credit, it is considered a partial disposition of the building, and the tax credit value would have to be lowered. Okay. And then the second is if the rehabilitation tax credits have been claimed within those 5 years preceding an easement donation, the amount of the easement contribution would have to be lowered. So to maximize those incentives, you have to create a little separation. And then the last is if there is a landmark program in your community, you can apply to be a local landmark. And most jurisdictions, at least in the Metro Atlanta area, offer what's called a landmark historic property tax abatement program. And you can continue to freeze your property taxes for another 8 years after the state's tax abatement program has expired. So, and then my last slide here, I know we're kind of running a little on time, is the legislation affecting preservation easements. The federal legislation, I don't really foresee any more amendments to the Internal Revenue Code because there were quite a number in 2006. In my opinion, all those amendments were very reasonable, and we're just kind of moving forward from, you know, issues that have happened in the past. I think there is a focus right now to remove golf courses as a qualified property type. As you can imagine, golf courses use a lot of chemicals, a lot of water. Sometimes they are in private communities, so they don't necessarily provide a public benefit. And most of the states that have tax credit programs have already eliminated them. The state legislation, as I mentioned before, we currently do not have the equivalency of an easement program tax credit at the state level. We did offer one between 2006 and 2012. However, by 2013, the tax incentives for preservation tax easements have been written out of the code. So there's a small group of us trying to reinstate them. So, and then there's.
All right. So we've got a few minutes for questions. I'm sure you're like me. This is so much great information to take in. So let's see what we've got first.